Hey folks, hey, welcome. Sorry about the Class Connect not working, but I decided maybe I'll make a video and see if this will work out for you. So, let's get to it. This is our Unit 1 test review. Starts off with, we talked a lot about cities, so let's talk about cities here. One of the characteristics of cities between the year, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that they grew for certain reasons. One of those main reasons is this right here, job opportunities. So I'm going to put that right here. Okay, so it was our job opportunities that caused, let's write it in. Jobs. Okay, between the Civil War and 1920, cities grew because of jobs. Immigrants most likely chose to live in the city. And you can imagine this is because where they come from, a lot of them coming from Europe and places like that, they left big cities and they know big cities. And also in the city they could be with like-minded people. They could group together with other people from their country. So living out in the countryside, they felt a lot more isolated. So another reason why cities began to grow is because of transportation. So there was a lot of innovations like the cable cars and things like that made it possible for people to live outside of the city but work in the city. So that means cities began to grow quite a bit actually. So the suburbs became part of the city and things. So the cities started to expand outward. People were living nearby. So alright. Entertainment. Let's look at entertainment in the late 1800s and early 1900s. One of the biggest ones, one of my favorite ones, of course, was baseball. Became much more popular in the early 1900s. Oh, can't see that picture very well, but yeah, baseball, one of my favorites. Became much more popular during this time period. It became America's game. And vaudeville, remember those acts you see on stage? We saw a couple of representations of that in the textbook, but a dazzling display of heterogeneous splendor designed to educate, edify, amaze, and uplift. Sounds like fun, huh? Let's go check it out. The Ferris wheel, this one is the one in Chicago in Hyde Park, one of the world's biggest to begin with. It's late, it has been replaced by some other big ones, but it was a good one to start with. Lots of people started going to the movies during this time period. They became big. They were mostly silent movies, and they were called Nickelodeons because you got smacked in the face with green slime. No, wait a minute. That's our most recent Nickelodeon. The old Nickelodeon was it cost you 5 cents to get in, so they called them Nickelodeons. And Coney Island was a big attraction as well. Coney Island is in New York. It was one of the world's first amusement park type places, and it's still there. You can still go visit Coney Island. It's much like it was back in the early 1900s, so kind of a cool place to check out. During this time period, you see a lot of people moving together and working together, and that seems to usually create a certain amount of social stratification. So social stratification refers to this arrangement of individuals into divisions of power and wealth. I've found this example. It's pretty easy to find social stratification for things like the Egyptians. So it was obvious, the pharaoh was up top, and then you had other rulers, scribes, and worked its way all the way down to the common people. We started to see this happen more often during this time period. In the cities, people crammed together and they needed to create some sort of hierarchy. Well, it usually ended up being based upon, who had the most money at the time. So ethnicity came into play, race, and social class were three big players in this social stratification. So who got to be on top depended on things like what race you were and where you came from. So cities growing meant that there wasn't a lot of room. So guys like Louis Sullivan and William Jenney started to create things like skyscrapers. They took advantage of vertical expansion. There's not a lot of place to go sideways in a city because there are other buildings in the way, but you can always build higher, right? Here's an image of some of the tallest buildings in the world now, and these were Obviously, most of these are more recent than the ones Louis Sullivan and William Jenney started to build, but if they didn't start building them, we wouldn't have them. Here on the left, we have the Burj Dubai, which is the tallest in the world. It's in Dubai, of all places. This one is in Taipei. This one is in Shanghai. I've actually been to the top of that one. There's a glass floor in it. You can look down over all of that. It's kind of creepy. In fact, it was really funny to watch people step on the glass tiles like they were afraid that they were going to fall through, and it was kind of funny. The Petronas Towers in Malaysia and a few other Sears Towers, which is now called something else. I can't remember what it's called. In Chicago. So you can see there's some super tall buildings out there in the world. The Burj Dubai, of course, being the tallest, is ridiculously huge. Also has the fastest elevator in the world, the Burj Dubai. It goes up at 36 miles per hour from bottom to top. That's cruising for an elevator. Alright, so skyscrapers are a big deal in the early 1900s. A couple of guys that started, we talked about William Jenney. This is some more information about him. He was born in 1832 and died in 2007. He's what called the father of the modern skyscraper. He built one of the first ones, which was the Chicago's Home Insurance Building, and it was 12, 13 stories, I think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Yeah, 12 stories. And he came up with the idea of using a steel skeleton to help hold it all up. Most of the buildings at the time had been built with just bricks and masonry, so you could only build so tall. But he decided to build a skeleton out of steel and then just use the outside, the facade. The outside of the building is all stone, but the inside is all steel, which was allowed for a much taller, stronger, tall building. Louis Sullivan, born right around the same time, 1856, died in 1924. He comes from the Chicago School of Architecture, and he believed that form follows function. He designed these big, square, ugly buildings. I mean, they're pretty cool looking, I guess, but there's not a lot of flash to them. They're just big square blocks, but they do what they need to do. They use up every little bit of usable vertical space, and these big square buildings like this, there's a lot of room inside and a lot of function to them. So he believed in form that followed function. Some other important aspects of city design at this point were not just where the buildings are going to go, but how we're going to survive in these cities. And Frederick Law Olmsted came up with a great idea for the city of New York called Central Park, based upon parks he had seen in European cities. Like there's a great big park in London that I visited before. It's pretty amazing. You walk in the park and you don't even feel like you're in the middle of a city anymore. Central Park is kind of the same way. That's fun to visit too if you get the chance. You take a few steps in the park and get within some trees and you don't even realize that you're in the city anymore. So lots of leisure, lots of recreation, great place to hang out. Central Park is huge. You can see in the picture down here on the bottom. It actually lowers the temperature of the surrounding area in the summertime. It's cooler in Central Park than it is 2 blocks away. So it's pretty cool. No pun intended. Okay. D.H. Burnham. He was a guy. Sorry, you can't read that very well. Let me highlight that. D.H. Burnham. He was a guy who lived in Chicago, and he was also really important for city planning. He came up with this idea of the plan of Chicago, and here's one of his original drawings. Now, if you've been to some old cities, like old European cities, old cities like even Washington, D.C., and some of those original cities in the U.S., they're kind of a mess because they weren't really planned. There was no land set apart for certain things. The city just kind of grew up, and the roads that used to be goat tracks in the 1700s became roads, and then they paved them, and so they're windy and tiny and messy and things like that. More modern cities, like a lot of you have been down to Salt Lake. Salt Lake was planned with really wide streets, straight intersections, none of this. You can see some of these roads on this map here crossing at 45-degree angles and odd things like that. Make it kind of difficult to build a city around because you have some weird blocks of land and you have to build a triangle-shaped building and stuff like that. So guys like D.H. Burnham, they they were the very first city planners, really, and they started to look at, from the beginning of a city, you need to make sure that there's room for growth for the city to get as big as possible. He developed some plans for Washington, D.C., Cleveland, San Francisco. Not all of them were adopted, but they did a good job looking ahead at how cities are going to be in the future. All right, here's one of your favorite characters from the book. Who was this guy? Well, we know this guy here. That's Boss Tweed as part of the Tammany Hall political machine. Let me write that up here. And as we talked about in class, these political machines actually did quite a bit to help people. All these immigrants coming, they did some great things. They built schools. They helped them if their house burned down. They would, help them find a new place and take care of them for a while. But the biggest problem is they were on the graft, G-R-A-F-T, which means they are taking money off the top. They are taking bribes and stealing. Boss Tweed was one of the biggest ones. You remember we watched that video where it showed that the City Hall building, or courthouse, that he was supposed to build for $350,000 got built for over $13 million, and all the extra went into people's pockets. So that's the Tammany Hall political machine. So keep an eye on that. Let's talk about some women reformers. Jane Addams. As these cities got bigger and bigger, more people who were poorer and poorer started to move into the cities looking for jobs, and they had nowhere to live. It got crowded and there was no place for them. So people like Jane Addams started to take notice of this and try to help these people out. She was the first woman to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, mostly because she founded what's called the Hull House. Okay, Jane Addams put together the Hull House in Chicago. It was what's called a settlement house. It's a temporary home to assist the urban poor. Try to help those people who were coming in, try to help them get up on their feet, teach them what they need to know, help them find a new place to live and send them out. So this is similar to what the political machines were doing, the same kind of goal, but without the corruption. Okay. She became a leader of the settlement house movement. She helped establish settlement houses all over the country. She was an author, and she was a leader in the women's suffrage and world peace movements as well. Let's talk a little bit about some more social reform in the Populist Party, the People's Party, which actually served the farmers more than anybody. They wanted greater regulation of business. This is the free silver movement. They wanted the gold standard done away with, and everything to be hinged upon silver instead. Most historians look at populism, though, as a failed movement. It didn't really work out as they had planned, but it did set the stage for a lot of other political reforms that did help out. One of the next we'll talk about is the progressives. Kind of set the stage for those. Let me take a look here. Yeah, so the next movement that kind of Populist Party helped set the stage for was the progressive movement. They were big on conservation. It's because of the progressive movement that we have national parks. Yellowstone National Park, thanks to Teddy Roosevelt, he was big in this progressive movement. And the Salvation Army is a big one too. You guys see the Salvation Army out there ringing their bells every Christmas. They're a progressive organization, and their goal was to provide food and shelter for the poor. So the Salvation Army comes out of this progressive movement. Also, out of the progressive movement, we get direct election of U.S. senators. Now, the way we elect our senators, we get to vote for them exactly how we want to. And that is great thanks to this progressive movement. So, now we spend a little bit of time. These guys were also progressives, and it was important that they exposed some of the corruption and some of the bad things that were going on. These guys were called, and some of you guys have done reports on them, these guys were called our muckrakers. Yeah, our muckrakers. Okay, like our picture down here, we have Upton Sinclair raking through this meat scandal. Ray Stannard Baker was one of them. Upton Sinclair was one of them. He wrote a book called The Jungle about the meat packing industry, specifically in Chicago. He was trying to expose some of the problems with immigrants, but he also exposed a lot of the issues with the meat scandal. And so because of him, we have the FDA and some other things come out. But these guys, their main goal was to expose corruption in business and government. Ida M. Tarbell, a lot of you have written a report on her. She reported on John D. Rockefeller, if I can spell his name right. That dirty feller, Dirty Rockefeller. He had some pretty corrupt business practices at Standard Oil, creating monopolies and colluding to make the prices go higher so he could make more money. Okay, so these muckrakers really helped out as part of this progressive movement. Another person who really helped make some changes during this time period was Woodrow Wilson. He became president in 1912. Teddy Roosevelt and William Taft both were running at the same time, and because they took away a bunch of the votes from other people, Woodrow Wilson, oddly enough, won the presidency. It was one of those where he wasn't necessarily the most popular, but because there were other people in the race who were popular, like Teddy Roosevelt and Taft, they split up the vote, and it led to Wilson being able to seize the presidency. He opposed these monopoly powers. Okay, he didn't like the monopoly dude. He wouldn't go if he was alive today when McDonald's was doing the monopoly thing. He wouldn't eat there. I promise. He hated. No, it wasn't the game he hated. He hated the people who would do these monopolistic things, and he figured that was bad for capitalism. It was against the rules, and so he favored a little bit more government. To help out with monopolies, but on the other hand, lots of other backing off of government, I guess. He supported a graduated income tax, which means the more money you make, the more taxes you pay, and we'll get into that a little more in some other sections, but that's one thing he voted for as well. All right. During this time period, cities growing, but what's happening out in the rural areas? We have some racial injustices. This is post-Civil War, obviously, so blacks are now free. There's no slavery, but there are still many practices that put blacks in bad situations and kept them oppressed. One of those was sharecropping, was a big one. They had to... it just never really let them get out of that cycle of debt and despair. They had to buy everything from their landowners, who charged all these crazy prices. So even if they made a profit on their crops at the end of the year, they would have to buy all the seed for the following year from these landowners, and they'd charge them so much that they'd never make a profit, and they kept them pretty much always in poverty. Jim Crow laws started to pop up at this point, laws that were unfair towards blacks. Poll taxes and literacy tests made it almost impossible for any of the blacks to vote. But you have some Supreme Court rules in 1869, in this case called Plessy versus Ferguson, that it's okay to segregate as long as the facilities are equal. So you can see, like our picture down here, we have a drinking fountain for the whites and a drinking fountain for the blacks. They don't really look equal right off the top of the bat, do they? But you know, this one spurts water and that one spurts water, so it's okay. Technically they were equal, and they are separate. So this, according to Plessy versus Ferguson, this is allowed, that you're allowed to do that in 1896. Eventually other Supreme Court decisions will come along and overturn that, but in 1896 it was okay to separate. And that made some folks upset, of course. You can imagine. Guys like this one here, he seemed at the beginning to accept, if you haven't guessed his name yet, this is Booker T. Washington. Okay, he seemed to accept segregation, at least on the top. He didn't really fight against segregation, but as you can see down at the bottom, he was funding litigation or lawsuits against civil rights things. So at least his public persona was that, you know, segregation is okay. His big deal was, though, he wanted equal schooling, or the opportunity to school for the blacks, and he founded the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute. It's one of the first institutions to admit blacks, higher education institutions. Okay. All right, so that's him. Let's look at another reformer. This guy is the initials W.E.B. Du Bois. That's how you actually spell his name, Du Bois. And I spelled it wrong. There we go. W.E.B. Du Bois, or Du Bois as a lot of you will call him. He was actually the first African American to graduate from Harvard. He got his PhD from Harvard, which was a big deal, and it was hard for him to do because there was a lot of prejudice at that time. He actually opposed Booker T. Washington's support of accommodation, because, like we said here, Booker T. Washington seemed to accept segregation, and W.E.B. Du Bois said, you can't have it both ways. It's got to be one way or the other. Everything's got to be equal. Everybody's got to be on the same page. He helped form the NAACP, which is still around today, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and he helped launch some of the Niagara movement to end segregation. The Niagara movement had a lot to do with women's rights as well as blacks. And then we have Marcus Garvey. He was also a reformer. Okay. He founded the United Negro Improvement Association, which isn't around as much as the NAACP anymore, but it was a good step in the right direction. He stressed the need for black-owned businesses. He wanted blacks to be able to own and operate their own businesses so that they could get ahead. That was one of the big things he pushed for. Some other movements at this point in time were the women's suffrage movement. Suffrage again means voting, like you can see down here, votes for women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Julia Ward Howe were three of the biggest leaders of this women's suffrage movement, and through their efforts we get what's the amendment that gives women the right to vote? The 19th Amendment gave the women the right to vote. So through their big efforts, and thanks to them. Alright, there is no part 2 to this test, so there won't be any essay questions or anything like that. It's just the multiple choice, so get that done. Let me know if you have any questions about the test before you take it. This review is up in the doc sharing area, so you can take a look at that. And be thinking about a research topic. As soon as you're done with the test, we got to start in on your research project for Unit 2. Let me know if you have any questions.